In this section, I want to discuss the process of entity selection and formation. I get asked a lot of questions about this by small business people, and I think it's a pretty interesting topic. And there are probably some conventional wisdoms that we need to dig into, some things that maybe people assume that aren't always true. So, and one thing that I want to explain before I get started is that anything that you hear in this section should not be construed as legal advice. If you have any questions about anything that I've said, please do consult with an attorney. Know that I have never passed a bar exam in the state of Kansas, or any other state for that matter, and so I'm not licensed to give you legal advice. I'm going to talk to you about some things that I've seen and some things that I hopefully know and understand reasonably well, but I am not an attorney, and so anything that I say can't be considered to be legal advice. But I do want to talk about this process of entity selection and formation. The first thing that you might want to understand is that it's actually pretty easy to go into business, at least in the state of Kansas. Probably easier than most people think. In fact, the only thing that you absolutely have to be in business is you have to have a customer who's willing to give you money in exchange for some product or service that you hope to provide. It really is that simple. In fact, in the state of Kansas, you can even take a DBA, or a fictitious name for your business. DBA stands for doing business as. So if I make and sell kitchen cabinets, I might like to do business as Kaw Valley Kitchen Cabinets. I can actually take that name as a DBA without filling out any registration paperwork for the business, without asking for permission to do the name, to use the name. I don't need to do anything like that. Today, I could choose to start Kaw Valley Kitchen Cabinets with a fictitious name, and I could do business that way. In fact, I could do millions of dollars worth of sales. I could hire employees. I can do anything that any business can do, pretty much, as a sole proprietor. In fact, I would take it one step further and say that if you go into business and you don't do any kind of registration, you don't seek any kind of legal permissions, basically what you are is you're a de facto sole proprietor. You're a sole proprietor by virtue of the fact that you haven't done anything different. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is a perfectly legitimate way to do business. It can be really effective. It can be a good way to start up. It can be a low-cost way to start up. There are some potential downsides. The biggest one is that as a sole proprietor, you and the business are the exact same legal and financial entity. And so a lot of small business people are curious and want to know more about the process of separating the two legal and financial entities. Because if you're doing business as a sole proprietor, let's say you start Kaw Valley Kitchen Cabinets and you're doing a few $1 million worth of kitchen cabinet sales, and you hire some people to deliver and install the cabinets, and you buy a delivery van and you stencil your name on the side of it, which you're perfectly capable of doing. You're able to do that legally. If you do it that way and something goes wrong, let's say the people that you hire to deliver your cabinets drive the delivery van through the wall of the quick shop on the corner of 9th and Mississippi, and they do a couple $1 million worth of property damage, and they break some little kid's leg. If you're a sole proprietor and somebody decides to sue Kaw Valley Kitchen Cabinets, they're suing you personally, and your personal assets could potentially be at stake in a lawsuit like that. And so there are a lot of ways to separate the two legal and financial entities. In Kansas, there are two different types of corporations that you could form, S Corp or C Corp. You could form an LLC. I think that's a pretty common way to go. There are also LLPs, limited liability partnerships, professional associations, PAs, possibly even some other entities that I can't think of right now or that I'm not aware of. But in all of those cases, you are creating a separate legal and financial entity. Again, if you choose not to do that and your employees drive the delivery van through the wall and somebody sues you, you could have your personal assets at stake. If you created a separate entity, chances are your personal assets are more likely anyway to be a little bit more protected. Also, I want to mention a brief word about partnerships or general partnerships. A partnership is actually just the plural version of a sole proprietorship. And so if you do go to an attorney and you give them specific directions, hey, please draw up some partnership paperwork for me and my business partner, we want to form a general partnership, it's possible that your attorney could give you some legal advice unsolicited and say, you know, are you sure you want to form a partnership? If you do, it's possible still that your personal assets could be at stake if somebody sues the business. It's also possible that your attorney could just draw up the paperwork and assume that you know that in the case of a general partnership, your assets and your partner's assets could potentially be at stake. Again, a general partnership still looks like this. It just means that you have a business partner. In fact, that can bring up some additional complications in the form of something that is known as agency. In the case of a general partnership, if one of the partners does something ridiculous and knuckleheaded and gets the business sued, if that partner owns, I think the number is 30% or more of the business, then any other partner that owns a piece of that business could be held personally liable. And in the case of a lawsuit, their personal assets could be at stake. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the difference between those entities. I think it's just important for you to understand the difference between sole proprietorship and general partnership, or corporation, LLC, LLP, or some of these other entities. There are 3 questions that I think you should ask yourself if you are trying to decide whether or not you should form some kind of a business entity. The first question is, how risky is the business or industry that you're going to be in? If you're going to open a restaurant, for example, I would say that could be a pretty risky business or industry. You're going to likely have a storefront. People could be walking in and out of, you know, who knows what happens if somebody slips on a banana peel on the public sidewalk in front of your place of business. That's something to consider. I think there's a certain amount of risk that goes along with food service as a general rule. If you're going to be performing some kind of a limited service, mostly for people that you know, you're going to be doing business out of your house mostly, maybe there's not as much risk involved in something like that. In fact, maybe you could just buy some kind of professional liability insurance and feel pretty good about the legal protection that you've got. So question number 1, how risky is the business or industry? Question number 2 is, what do I have to lose? What kind of assets do I need to protect? If you're early career, if you're young, if you're not really concerned about what assets you have that you might lose in the case of a lawsuit, you know, again, I'm not trying to give you legal advice, but if you don't have anything to lose if somebody sues the business, maybe you don't need to form a separate business entity, at least not right away. The third question is, which business entity or structure will allow you to keep the largest percentage of your earnings? I think the biggest difference between the entities is the tax treatment that they get. Corporations have a very different type of taxation structure than an LLC. I would say that an LLC is probably the simplest separate entity to form. And in fact, according to the IRS, an LLC is a disregarded entity for the purposes of filing a federal tax return. In other words, an LLC, a single member, single owner LLC, gets treated in exactly the same way a sole proprietor gets treated for the purposes of federal tax returns. So there are a lot of different ways that you can go.